Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for first braving the rain on this rainy Friday morning, but thank you for braving the rain and coming out here to join us for Harvard Worldwide Week. We're really excited to have you here with the Center for International Development of Harvard. We're based here at the Kennedy School. My name is Fatima Sumar. I'm the Executive Director of CID, but the Brain Trust is really over here. And so I'm so excited to introduce you here to our amazing panelists. And let me just scene set a little bit first before I introduce them about today, the conversation. CID is one of the research centers here at the Kennedy School that obviously focuses on international development. The name's not just cute, it's accurate. And it really brings together really cross-cutting intersectional work, marrying the research agenda with the pressing needs of practitioners today. And we do that in so many different ways. And we want to share with you a little bit in this showcase this morning what some of that work actually looks like on the front lines from our colleagues in the Growth Lab and Evidence for Policy Design and one of our student ambassadors at CID. And really help understand, explain the work that they're doing, how they see the most pressing development issues of the day, and ways that others can partner with CID if you're interested in learning more. So that's a quick scene set of the conversation today. Let me introduce our amazing panelists. We are going to record this session with your permission. And so if you have any questions when we get to that part of it that would be particularly sensitive, just keep in mind we'll be recording the session as well. So first, let me introduce Charlotte Tuminelli, who's the Director for Evidence for Policy Design Training. And she oversees all of EPoD, what we call EPoD's training work. That's workshops, programs with exec ed, and all other projects looking at building capacity of policy actors. So Charlotte, thank you for being with us here today. We're joined by Alexa Weiss. Alexa is the Senior Research Manager at EPoD, and she oversees the management of Professor Rima Hanna's research portfolio. And prior to that role, she was a data research fellow at the Kennedy School Student Social Support R&D Lab. Did I get that right? Okay, great to see you, Alexa. Then we have Douglas Barrio with us, who's the Policy Research Director at the Growth Lab. And he joined as a research fellow back in 2013. And before that, he was in McKinsey's Bogota office as a public sector specialist, where he served the public and social sector actors and organizations throughout Latin America. So it was great to have you with us here today. And finally, I'm so pleased to introduce Manasa Acharya. She is one of our CID's new graduate student ambassador leaders. She's a second-year student ambassador, and she's currently a master's candidate at Harvard's Graduate School of Design, and she's pursuing her interests at the intersection of design thinking, urban analytics, and service delivery. So really excited to talk to you today. So should we get started? All right. So the first question I want to ask you is, I've been really struck. I've been here about 6 weeks in this role at CID, and my first time coming into academia formally on the research side. And I've just been really struck by the passion that students bring to the work and the energy here to really think through how to use the research, how to use that to really drive a policy agenda that's based on evidence, that's based on data, and based on some common sense too, and some logic, and how we're really at CID at the intersection of all of that. We've had conversations, as all of you know, in the last 6 weeks about so many different world events, whether that's climate change and the floods in Pakistan, whether that's looking at other pressing issues that are happening around economic growth strategies around the world. How can you, if you're a student here at Harvard, how can you get involved in the work that you are all doing? And how can you bring that passion and that energy here at Harvard to connect it with the world outside? So that's my first question to each of you. Would anyone like to start? And you can play off of each other as well.
I'm happy to start
Sure.
if you like. So sure thing. So at the Growth Lab, I think we have many avenues for students to get involved. Particularly right now, we're in the process of having a student RA search to collaborate in kind of our emerging research agendas. Some of them include the refugee crisis from Venezuelan refugees, as well as Ukrainian refugees. We're also studying how can developing countries play a protagonist or play an active role in the global decarbonization agenda, in our agricultural work in many developing countries, so on and so forth. We have around 8 to 10 student opportunities, and we're looking to hire up to 20 student RAs for this semester. Last semester, I think we engaged with up to a dozen student arrays, and over the summer, we usually also interact with or facilitate internship opportunities for also over a dozen students that are based in many of our projects in which we have an active policy engagement. In the past year, this included having students from the Kennedy School and other schools at Harvard based in Namibia, in South Africa, in Kazakhstan, in different parts of the world in which we're actively engaged. And we're just providing an opportunity for students to either participate in our projects during our summer internships or participate into our core research during the fall and spring semesters. Addition for that, we're very active in hiring our own students. So the Growth Lab kind of envisions itself as an extension of the training that students provide or get at Kennedy School, and they're able to get some additional hands-on training before they actually go back to the world and serve as policymakers or as leaders in this space. I think we generally hire around 80% of our hires are MPID graduates. So we're always looking for ways for people to get engaged. I think the last way we also engage is that we serve as informal or formal advisors to PAEs and SIPAs. So in many instances, many of the people that work with us at some point, they were researching topics of interest to them that are very much aligned to our research agenda. So we sincerely find many ways to try to learn from our students and also facilitate opportunities for students at the Kennedy School to continue their learning.
I love that. There's so many different avenues to engage if you're a student here at Harvard with the Growth Lab through those avenues that you mentioned. Charlotte, do you want to talk about EPoD?
So EPoD training is much smaller than Growth Lab, so I don't have those impressive numbers yet. I'd really like to. But similarly to what Douglas was saying, our opportunities to get engaged tend to be paid work opportunities. So we hire students to help with content development and training delivery. So we had an undergraduate actually help translate all of our content to French for delivery in Morocco. And help write new cases that were all focused on evaluations that are aimed toward assessing and improving labor policy in Morocco. So very specific, and we hire for opportunities like that will usually have like a kind of niche angle like that. So I think those are usually fun because we get students engaged in work that they otherwise might not be engaged in, or something they were super interested in, and it's like a really specific opportunity. We also use students for our training deployments. So we use a teaching fellow model, which most folks at Harvard are familiar with. Our students sort of serve as this conduit from our faculty and the speakers and the theoretical nature of some of our lectures, to then helping policy actors apply the knowledge that they're learning in trainings. So our teaching fellows play a huge role in our programs, and we are always recruiting because the only pesky thing about students is like they graduate. So we always need more. So definitely two ways that we hire fairly frequently.
And before I turn to Alexa, Charlotte and Douglas, can you say a word also about if you're not a master's student?
Yeah.
If you're in another part of your academic journey here at Harvard, are there ways to engage with the Growth Lab and EPoD? Could you just say a quick word about that?
Sure. I think some of these same avenues also extend to undergraduate students. So some of our student arrays in the spring and fall semesters are actually undergraduate students. Actually, we have undergraduate students taking Professor Hausman's course at the moment. So maybe a bit of overachievers of taking that course, but they're taking advantage of this opportunity also to expand that learning and engaging in this as well. So these are not exclusive to only master's students.
Yeah, I think 50% of our hires for like the content development side of things have actually been undergrads. They have really good computer skills, help a lot. HTML, I don't know what I'm doing. So
and I know there's also opportunities for undergrad internships that we've been exploring and piloting as well. So lots of opportunities there. And I know also the executive ed programs, right, are great opportunities if you're an alumni from Harvard and looking for continuous education, either in your organization or with colleagues around the world as well. So Alexa, could you share a little bit, if you're a student here at Harvard, you're really engaged on the research side. How can students who are interested in international development connect with the research agenda around that from the work that you've seen?
Sure. I would plug that we have a lot of events through EPoD and CID to see researchers discuss what they're working on, and that can be a really good conduit to figure out what folks are interested in for studying or professionally. like Charlotte and Douglas mentioned, we work with a lot of interns at the undergrad and master's level. EPoD has an evidence core internship program as well, where we work with mostly undergraduates to match them with research projects or external collaborators where they can engage firsthand in the research over the summer. The EPoD research side also has a really robust pre-doctoral fellows program. So for students close to graduation, looking for next steps in research, we do hire a lot of folks generally for a year or two to really work full-time firsthand in making the research happen. And then at the PhD level, we also work with a lot of PhD students who have EPoD faculty as advisors and co-PIs on their research projects.
And Manasa, from a student perspective, so you're one of our student ambassadors, you're a second year student. What is it like as a student to engage both as a student ambassador, but also with the work CID is doing?
Yeah, definitely. So I think at the CID, there are a lot of different opportunities for students to get involved and also run things according to your own interests. So we have the speaker series, we have regular podcasts, and we have the end of the year event that we're going to host in April. And I think the best part about it is that you're able to work at the intersection of different global issues. And honestly bring all different perspectives from schools across campus. And apart from the CID, I think the other opportunities that I've made use of as a student who's interested in urban and regional planning have been at the Bloomberg Center at Harvard, which has tons of research toolkits available for people who are interested in city governance. They also have student jobs and fellowship opportunities, both for the summer as well as postgraduate. And there are also a lot of regional centers across campus, which can help you which can provide funding for the kind of research that you're interested in, if it's a particular geography, be it like South Asia Institute or doctor class or so on.
Thank you, I really appreciate that. So lots of ways to engage with the Center for International Development throughout your entire Harvard journey. So I want to pivot to a different type of conversation though. You know, as I think about the world, and I came as a practitioner to Harvard, and I've spent the last 15 years actually on the front lines of policymaking and decision-making around international development, aid budgets. When you're sitting here at Harvard though, and you look at the state of play, you look at the world, existential challenges we're facing, whether that's climate change, whether we're looking at widening inequality around the world, which is exacerbated, as we know, by the COVID-19 pandemic, as we look at both the cons and the benefits of the globalization agenda, as we look as the road towards the Sustainable Development Goals in 2030, and whether or not we are a little off track or way off track from achieving those goals. How do you think about where to start? How do you identify which projects, which issues are really pressing enough that you're going to devote limited resources to engage? So how do you make those decisions? Because there's, it's a little overwhelming sometimes when we think about all the issues that are out there. And then my second question to that is, how do you work to ensure that the research that's generated can actually be used and that the evidence that you generate is actually used by policymakers and not just sitting on a shelf somewhere, right? As is too often the case sometimes in the world that divides policy and research. So would love to get your thinking for those of you on the front lines of this, of how you make those decisions, and then how do you know it's actually being used?
I can tag team this one with Alexa, and yeah. Can I give the honest answer? Like I answer panel questions.
I'm assuming you guys want the honest answer.
Because I answer questions like the way that we do this work and I make these decisions. For EPoD training, we have to be somewhat opportunistic. My mission is always going to be getting policy actors to use more data and evidence. And by data and evidence, I mean everything from an administrative data set that's sitting on a shelf for example, a city government that could be informing policies that has insights in it, but actors don't know how to access that or think it's not actionable data to impact evaluations. So some of the work that Alexa can speak to, direct collaborations with government, really generating insights in real time about policies and programs as they're being deployed. So I want all of that to be used. my avenue for doing that often just depends on who I'm talking to. And I think the approach that we've found successful is finding those entry points where there is someone who's a little bit bought in already, where there's a little interest, a little tickle of like, I've heard that data-driven development is something I should be thinking about. And then we really try to seize on that. And by building capacity, by offering toolkits and information, we find that it helps people be less scared and intimidated by data. And I mean, this probably goes without saying, but the whole point of trying to have evidence-informed policy is because, as you were saying, we're off track from the SDGs. We have evidence out there about what works, doesn't. We have limited time, limited funding. So I think for us, it's prioritizing the things that there's demonstrated impact for. And yeah.
Yeah, and piggybacking off of Charlotte, relationships are key and finding buy-in, and it's really a process to connect with policymakers, and training might be part of that. Finding folks who are interested in using evidence, also building off one research project might lead to another research project with similar policy partners on different questions. And having the buy-in for that is really key. I think a lot of the programs and policies we evaluate at EPoD are really coming from the policy partners. The interest already exists in that country, in that government, in that agency, which I think is a lot more scalable and impactful than trying to helicopter in with the solution that we created in the lab and would like to deploy. Yeah, and I think making sure the evidence is really robust and explaining, thinking through the research design, making sure the conclusions we draw are going to be sound enough for people to make policy decisions that influence millions of people, and then communicating that clearly. You know, once we have kind of our academic models, we have our regression tables, communicating that in clear data visualization, good communication, thinking about a variety of audiences, the policymakers, the academics, the policymakers in other countries who might not be as familiar with the program, but might want to try something where they are as well.
I think in our case, some things we look for when we're trying to think of an active engagement is one, does this provide an opportunity to reframe a problem as an opportunity for developing countries, particularly bringing in the perspective of the global south around challenges such as remote work, a global decarbonization agenda, migration, etc. That's one side. The other side is this an opportunity for us to test the limits of our theoretical knowledge, right? So the theoretical knowledge was good enough to be published in a journal, but when you get down into practice, not always what you was good enough to be published is not good enough to do policy. And by testing the limits of the theory in practice, we're trying to understand what other avenues for research we can find there. And third, does this provide an actual opportunity to create either capacity building or creating public goods that could be leveraged, not necessarily by those we're actively interacting with, but those that can pick up what we generated, either a tool, a public good, a publication, a data set, and do more with it. So I think for that, and then going to that second point of how do we make sure that this is used, sometimes it's outside of our control. I would say that when you try to understand the causal relationship between you developing a research agenda and it having the expected meaningful impact you want it to have in the world, there are so many distances between your research and that it's hard to have to own that process fully. Now, having said that, I think that the beauty of being in a research center such as CID is that your research has many opportunities to provide impact. So opportunity A can be with a direct stakeholder on the ground you're collaborating with. Opportunity B can be through how that is documented and put in a publication that can be leveraged by stakeholders or policymakers elsewhere. Opportunity C can be how that is transformed into an input for classes that are taught by our faculty affiliates. Opportunity D can be through executive education, in which the policymakers come to us probably with a problem at hand, and we have an opportunity to engage them, and so on and so forth. So I think that the beauty of a place like CID and our different programs is that we have many tries at high quality research, putting that in the hands into the policymakers that may be willing and able to engage with it in a very practical way.
So, Manasa, I'm going to come to you in a moment. I just want to pick up on one thing Douglas said, and maybe, I don't want to put you on the spot, maybe give an example to illustrate the point that you made, that the gap sometimes between theory and reality.
Yep.
have you had experience, and I'm opening this up to any of you on the program side, have you had experience on where the research agenda had an academic theory of how the world was supposed to work? And that when you actually tested it in country X, it's not how it worked at all. And we had to go back and retest and refine our model. Could you give an example of what that actually could look like? Because sometimes when we talk in these theoretical ways, it can be hard to absorb and understand what we're saying.
Sure, no, definitely. I mean, I can provide a number
Without
of them.
without putting any one faculty or any.
No, but I can try to narrow it down. Also, so I'll just go two brief examples. One is that in kind of our way of viewing the world, kind of agglomerations are important for growth, because when you have an agglomeration, you're able to maximize the use of your public goods. You're able to maximize the way the knowledge that your place has is combined in order to generate new and different things. So agglomeration is key for development. There are issues with agglomeration as it leads to inequality and so on and so forth, but it's kind of a key element. There are places in which agglomeration cannot happen, right? So when we worked in Western Australia, it's a country the size of Mexico that has the population of Uruguay that is concentrated 95% in one city, right? So how does growth happen in the rest of that place? We work in Kazakhstan, which is a key trade route between China, Russia, and Europe. But internally, it's completely disconnected. So how does agglomeration happen? We worked in Namibia. So Namibia, the most populated center between Lusaka and Cape Town is an agricultural agglomeration, which the biggest city is of around 50,000 people. So our own, the whole, how we test theory is like, well, how would development happen in these places if agglomeration is constrained by political or geographic limitations? We need to go back and understand how remoteness happens, how development can happen in remote places. Similarly, we worked in the Colombian Amazon and the Peruvian Amazon. So how can, and where there are significant urban agglomerations there, but how can development happen while at the same time trying to be mindful of the development goals of protecting and preserving the Amazon? So how can we provide or generate good livelihoods for people that live there and will live there in a way that is consistent with our goals? So those are kind of testing our previous way of understanding, well, if you're thinking about development, have everybody kind of pick up and move to the biggest city. There are some instances in which that cannot happen and will not happen, and invites you to rethink about that. That's one kind of broader example. Other examples is, for instance, when we think about how diversification and the complexification of your economy should be kind of an important element for future. And we, for instance, worked in states in the northern Mexico that are perhaps one of the most diversified economies in Mexico, but are not growing as much as you would expect. But when you go down, you see that they export cars and airplanes and pieces for spacecrafts and so on and so forth. But in reality, what they do in many instances is that they assemble these things together. So they receive, these things are designed, conceptualized, manufactured elsewhere, but they're assembled in this part, right? And this means that the real knowledge that is embedded in this place is not the knowledge of making spaceships, it's the knowledge of putting things together. And hence, we need to go back and understand, is it really about exports, or is it really about where knowledge is embedded in places, and so on and so forth? I think essentially what we try to do in our applied projects is go back and say, and report back to our academic teams in many instances and say, look, I think there's a gap in what we did, or here's an idea of something we haven't understood before. But I think this is something we could discuss even more in other cases.
Well, we could have a whole topic just on this, because I have to say, on the practitioner side, where we've received the evidence and the knowledge base of where countries, for instance, should move on economic growth to address, for instance, their binding constraints to growth. And I've been the one to negotiate with those countries, with their foreign ministers or their finance ministers, to say, this is what the evidence says. And they'll say, that's great. I don't want the road there because it doesn't go through my political district. And I'm up for election next year. So I don't care that the road should go here to generate the expected returns. I want it over here, right? And the whole thing can fall apart after 4 years of research and careful design, for no simple other reason that there's an election coming up, as an example. And we didn't really consider enough the political economy components of when we presented the research. And maybe we should have waited till after the election, for instance. Maybe our timing was even off on how we constructed some of that. So I have lots of examples on the other side of this. but to think about. But Manasa, I want to bring you in because I want to talk a little bit about cities. And one of the greatest challenges we're seeing in growing economies and in developing countries right now is an explosion of megacities. And thinking through huge rates around urban around mobility, urban design, urban planning challenges. Obviously, climate is front lines and center about so many of those issues, but also the huge inequality gaps that we're seeing. And to be clear, not just in developing countries, but in developed economies, and the United States has one of the highest rates of inequality anywhere in the world. As you consider some of what you just heard, and as you think about the work you're doing here in your studies, how are you thinking about the role of urban planning and design, and kind of what the next generation needs to be thinking through here to help mitigate some of these expected crises that are coming?
Yeah, I think, when you asked how do you decide what problem to work on, I was just thinking about how I see urban planning as being a very important lever to address multiple sustainable development goals. So it cuts across a lot of different things, and not just urban planning. I'm thinking about urban and regional planning more broadly. So I think when it comes to housing or transportation, climate, health, equity, all of these issues are something that a planner would need to work with. And I also see the role of a planner to be someone who brings all the research evidence or best practices to actual implementation, because you're working on ground. And one of the ways in which I got interested in planning is also related to this, which is that I hadn't worked in urban planning prior to coming here, but I had worked with governments on issues of education, service delivery, and digital governance. And what I saw was that the spatial lens was very useful for coalition building, for getting stakeholders across different sectors together to have a shared vision, shared goal, and work towards something. So I think having that perspective when you're thinking about urban planning and not just thinking about, say, the boundaries of a city is something that I think would be really interesting when you're looking at international development. And also, from the point of view of international development and megacities, I think places like the CID and Harvard have a huge role to play in facilitating knowledge sharing across cities that otherwise might not talk to each other, but have similar contexts or similar constraints rather, and can learn from each other. So, for example, one of the first times I came across the term urban planning was when I visited Bogota, and I was floored by the work that they had done and how they had transformed the entire city just through urban planning and touched various different aspects of their citizens' lives. So I think there are a lot of things that are happening in Latin American cities or African cities that a place like India can learn from, because we are predicted to have one of the largest urbanizations over the next 30 years. And there are also lessons from, like you said, developed countries like the US. Like here, I learn about how transport is one of the major contributors to CO2 emissions in the US. And I feel like this, if we don't prepare well, this could be our future. Like, we shouldn't be repeating the mistakes that a lot of the developed countries have already achieved. And how do we also think about that and probably learn from places that don't have the same contexts, but do come under imaginations as something that we aspire to be. So in India, places like, say, Dubai or US would be the aspirational place to be. But in a lot of ways, it shouldn't. So how do we factor that into urban planning is also something I think that would be critical here.
One of the things, Vanessa, as you're talking, that struck me is, I've had the opportunity to travel to so many countries in the course of my career, and often when I land in Latin America or Asia or Africa, I think this, and I land at that airport that's newly built, or go on the newly constructed highway to the newly designed capital, because oftentimes now there's second capitals in a lot of places to address urban congestion issues. I think this is 10 times more advanced than Boston, for instance. Like we're the developing country back here compared to what some of the innovations we've seen. And I'm saying that because I think when we think about the role of learning, sometimes there's this outdated node when we talk about international development as an export model from the United States or from the West to developing economies. when in fact, and that's to me a very neo-colonial way of thinking about the work and the research. And one of the things I'm really struck by here at CID and the work that everyone is doing is that we're really also trying to equalize the learning playing field here so that we're also bringing in and sharing lessons learned, as you said, from Bogota, from Chennai, from other places that have really figured out some of these solutions in ways that we are struggling with here in the United States and in other developed economies, and breaking through some of these artificial barriers and silos that frankly are just artificial constructs of geographic borders, right? When we say between domestic or international development, I mean, in many ways, we're dealing with very similar challenges without the artifices of geography. So it struck me as you were saying, I've often had that, and I think there's an empowerment piece here also to the learning agenda that is something I'm really excited about here at CID. Alexa, I want to turn to you and ask you from a research perspective a question that I often had when I was on the practitioner side. So the word evidence is used a lot, right? And used very liberally in different ways. But what does it mean from your perspective that to have good evidence? What does that actually mean to have good evidence? Number one, and what does it mean for evidence to be trustworthy? That it means something. And I'm also saying that because I'm also struck in coming here that, I worked in Washington for many, many years. In Washington, everyone's an expert, right? It actually doesn't matter. The definition of expertise, it can be kind of loose, right? Relatively speaking. And so you can brand yourself on social media, you can brand yourself in different circles as an expert on issue X. But it means something else in a place like Harvard and at CID of what expertise means to generate trustworthy evidence. And I'd love to hear a little bit about how you think about that and how we can all think about what good evidence and trustworthy evidence looks like.
Sure. And I think that really ties into the last point you made about kind of like the case study export model of evidence. Because there is a kind of an older school of thought, like we can just look at what worked here and we'll tell you what worked here and it'll work for you. And I think the research teams at EPoD are really working on generating robust evidence in the places where these programs and policies will hopefully, if successful, be implemented. And to do that, we use a lot of tools, mostly from economics, microeconomics, related disciplines. I'd say one of our most common designs is the randomized control trial, really thinking about the classical scientific method, comparing a treatment group to a control group. That's kind of the gold standard we use for drug trials, other branches of science. And there's many, many cases in program and policy design where you can apply those same methods. We work with some other kind of quasi-experimental methods as well from the fields of econometrics. And I would say we do a lot of emphasis on figuring out what research design is going to be practical. How can you introduce randomization to what does a treatment group and a control group mean in a policy context? That might mean rolling out a program in some districts first, some districts after, seeing how the outcomes are in those two sets of districts. And we also think a lot about sample size, statistical power. If this evaluation happens, do we have enough data to draw reliable conclusions? And thinking about what kinds of data we're generally working with in the policy environment, we work a lot with program administrative data. A lot of government programs accumulate massive amounts of data just to run their programs. I can think about anything from program rosters, which citizens are enrolled in a particular welfare program. You can think about less traditional data sources, maybe like bus ticket taps in a transportation network. So a lot of administrative data, and we also work with survey data, sometimes that our research team collects for a particular purpose, and sometimes data that surveys that other country governments collect, maybe kind of like a census or an American community survey in the US context, but a lot of countries have their similar national sample surveys.
No, thank you. So I have one last question, then I'm going to open it up to all of you for whatever questions you have. So we'll do a little speed lightning round as the last question. But I want to ask, and feel free to be very honest about this. What's the hardest development challenge you've worked on? That's just really stumped you, where it's not what you thought it was going to be, or you're still working through it. Just to give our audience also a sense of the complexity sometimes of the world that we work in. Anyone want to take that first?
Well, I mean, I'm happy to take this. And I think it goes back to what you were mentioning before from the practitioner perspective. So if beyond the theoretical limitations, I think that there is a limitation of how you put the theory into practice. And for us, I think we've labeled it kind of the importance of the sense of us in policymaking, right? So when you go to a place, that place has an identity as a place and has a sense of who we are as a nation. And the interaction between that and the technically correct, quote unquote, way to address a problem is a way that you cannot do it from here, right? And trying to build that bridge between what is the sense of a place and what is the perceived technically correct solution to a problem, so that we can find the second, third, or fourth best option to actually move ahead. I think it's something that continuously stumps us, because it's impossible from us to guess what is the sense of us of a place, or how that evolves over time, and how it might land when we're engaged now or in the future. So I think it's more of I don't know if it's something that's done, because I don't think it's something we'll solve, but something that how to be more mindful of that when thinking about a problem, when thinking about policy options, and when thinking how to effectively engage with places. I think it's something that I guess is continuously on our mind.
Yeah, no, and I love that. And that very much resonates with me, that every country, every location has its own character and culture and identity that we sometimes really don't fully appreciate as we're looking at solutions on paper, as we think that through. Anyone else like to share?
Yeah, I think the thing that continues to stump me over my 6+ years at EPoD is translating individual skills and motivation changes as a result of training to behavioral impact. And it comes back to the point you raised about transitions in political administrations and working within the incentives of a broader context. So I think I'm also very aware of trying to avoid that helicoptering in and delivering a training and not thinking about the context. 2 years down the line, are the people that I'm working with right now still going to be in positions where they could implement changes? And I think it's part of that is moving away from that World Bank 1990s approach of we'll just come in and do a 1-week training and tell you what worked at this other place that we read a paper about. And so it's leveraging the local knowledge, and we work with local instructors to do more of a training of trainers approach, so that, in theory, the knowledge is then embedded. But yeah, I have not cracked I think I'm not alone in this, but it's really hard to assess the on the ground impact in a long-term way. And I think it's hard to have that impact.
Yeah, I think very similar to Douglas and Charlotte. I think a big challenge is just incorporating the generation and review of evidence into the policy process, especially when there are a lot of place specific or political considerations that also go into policy, but just building in to the policymaking system. From the data systems, having databases that are accessible and track the kinds of things that a government might need year on year to be evaluating programs, to building the generation and review of evidence into the regular part of the policymaking process, having those departments, and really training leaders to make sure to show the importance of generating and reviewing this evidence and considering it in policy decisions.
Manasa, you get the final word. I'll turn it over to our audience.
I think I'm at a stage in my career where there are a lot of different issues that I'm still grappling with, and I don't have the answer to. But I think one of the things that comes to mind from having worked where I did before is probably embedding the idea of iterative thinking and experimentation in legacy institutions, not just governments, but say smaller communities. So evidence has its place, but evidence usually takes a really long time to form. And then if you're trying to implement it on ground, it just needs one politician to say that, this is not going to work, or it needs a few people to get together and rebel against it for it to fall apart. But then how do you get people to think about any kind of problems that might arise with the solution as an opportunity, as Douglas was mentioning, and iterate towards improving upon it, given their own context and own constraints. So how can you, how do you have that kind of learning mindset in institutions is something that.
And I love that you brought that up, because one of the other programs we have at CID is also with our building state capabilities. And this is exactly one of the issues that they think through is problem-driven iterative approaches and PDIA methodology to really think a lot of this through, and some really cutting edge research and work in that space. So thank you for also bringing that point in. So let me open it up to you. Anything's fair game, I guess, or they'll tell you if it's not. And Kareem, would you like to start?
Thank you so much for this.
Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Kareem. I'm a research fellow here at CID. So thanks for this introduction. My understanding that our ultimate goal is to make sure that our research and teaching is translated into policies, and then these policies do to real change on the ground in developmental outcomes, positive change. So my question to you is, based on your experience, I mean, when we are successful in doing that, when does really the research translate into good developmental outcomes, and what are some of the challenges that prevent research to translate into developmental outcomes?
Give you an easy one.
I mean, so for me, it goes to something you mentioned as well, is that the stakeholders we engage with, they need to be protagonists of their own story. They need to own this. They need to own the theory. They need to own the policy design. They need to own the implementation. And we can do our best in order to adapt our methodology so that we can reproduce them with the available data and try to design a policy that, to our best of our understanding, works within the policy framework. But if you don't have stakeholders on the other side that own this process and buy into it and adapt it to their own realities, I think we're usually dead on arrival. And then sometimes I think it's still a fruitful exercise, because in our experiences, sometimes we quote unquote be dead on arrival, but the research output has been picked up by policymakers elsewhere, and that they have proactively engaged with us and say, look, I think this thing you produce there, it's not almost there, but I really buy into this logic, and I think we can make it work. So for me, it's fundamental that there needs to be ownership from the stakeholder side, and there needs to be openness from our side also to revisit some of our priors. I think, we act or we understand the world a lot in kind of Bayesian priors. So our baseline theoretical approach could have told us, this is likely to be the case, but when engaging with the policymaker, we should be able to reset our priors and say, you know what, this thing we thought was important, maybe, or a limitation, maybe it's not much of a limitation. So there is a co-learning process. So for me, those two elements are very important.
I can,
Sorry.
no, I was just going to add that because it's a little different, I think, on the training side, because we're less focused on actual research generation. We're kind of taking the things that you all create and bringing them into the world. And for me, again, I would really love to more rigorously evaluate the impact at scale. But for us, little success stories are when we follow up with our trainees and they tell us, like we had one trainee from Pakistan who was looking at collecting rent from properties along a railway corridor, and he conducted a cost benefit analysis after taking one of our trainings and said to us, I wouldn't have done this without taking the content. So I think for us, those are little ways to demonstrate success. But again, if you know anyone who wants to fund rigorous evaluations of training, just let me know.
I'm just going to jump in really fast, and then we'll just to say one other dimension that I've seen a lot is time. Time is a dimension here that we don't often think through enough. And so I will say, when I sat on the other side of this equation, I was under huge budget and time constraints to spend money by certain dates. And so if I'm going to use research or evidence, I need it to be quick. I need it to be in ways that actually meet my timelines, which could be very different than what the research agenda timelines can look like as well. And so I think this translation also of not just knowledge, but when the knowledge can be used and iterated quickly enough and adapted enough to actually meet the needs of practitioners for me was one of the biggest challenges, actually. So, I mean, I could pose a lot of questions of what I was interested in. It didn't mean I could get the answers back in a time frame where I could use that knowledge to actually inform good decision-making. And so oftentimes I felt like I was making imperfect decisions knowingly, but I had to make a decision, get the money out the door, even if it was imperfect. It solved other problems for me, right? Other issues for me that were also as relevant, the decisions I had to make. So I just wanted to.
Apologies, just to build on that briefly, I think borrowing from our friends at Building State Capabilities, this idea of having an authorizing environment. And not only you have champions on the other side, but that they have an authorizing environment to make these decisions on the moment, and also have the leeway to quote unquote experiment by listening to research versus what you've been doing before. So I would just wanted to follow up on that briefly.
Thank you. Please introduce yourself, and we'll take both questions together. So please introduce yourself. And can they hear, can folks hear on the recording the questions? Okay, great.
So I've got two quick questions. The first one's just a practical one. So,
Introduce yourself.
oh, sorry, my name is Christian Kenshi. I'm a first year Master in Public Policy student. Quick question. You mentioned there's a couple of RA positions. So just wanting to know how they advertise in a more practical sense to get involved. And the second question is, there's a lot of discussion around building and working with governments and other stakeholders. So I was just wondering, can you tell me a bit more about that kind of capacity building, public sector capacity building side, and how that works? And do you actually look to partner with governments or NGOs or both? And just on the EPoD training side, the Australian government, the Prime Minister's Department and DFAT are actually working quite closely together on actually impact analysis training for Southeast Asia. And that's just a kind of another kind of real kind of world example of how there's a lot of focus in that kind of side. So just opening it up.
Thank you, Krish.
Yeah, Morgai. I'm currently a second year MPAD student. My question is, what's the most interesting question that you think you guys have already answered in the past? And what's the most interesting one you're currently working on? And maybe on Growth Lab is the answer, if the answer is something like remoteness or green growth, maybe like tools, what's the most interesting tool or the ones you're building towards? Or
Okay, so we've got about 4 questions that came there, looking at where exactly can students learn about opportunities to engage, if you could share that. Looking at the different, Krish, let me say your second question, right, on training.
Yeah, public sector capacity building.
How are we actually doing public sector capacity building? And also just, is it only with governments? Are we working with other actors? Because we talked a lot about governments this morning, but I don't want to leave an impression that that's all we're looking at. And then what's the most pressing challenge question that you have answered, we have answered, right? And what's on your mind that we're working on right now? So those 4 questions, pick one maybe. I don't think each of us can do, or each of you can do all of them. So maybe pick a piece that you'd like to engage on.
I'll say, for starters, we have some positions posted on the EPoD website. I believe particularly for a full-time fellow would come in next year. And we post those on social media too, EPoD's Twitter account. And I guess I can't pretend that we've like solved a universal problem like welfare or labor market development, but I can give a couple like case studies we've worked on and are working on, and talk a little about like building buy-in with policy partners. In Indonesia, in about 2016, the government was interested in transitioning from in-kind distribution of food assistance, like giving folks bags of rice, to more of a flexible e-voucher system, giving folks like a debit card that could be used at an authorized vendor to buy rice or eggs. And we did what I thought was a really cool impact evaluation where the transition from rice to cards was phased across 105 districts, and there were surveys conducted by the government, regular national sample surveys that kind of lined up with that rollout. So we could see what the effects were in places that were still on the in-kind versus getting the flexible e-vouchers, and the results were really compelling that switching to the e-vouchers helped the government target the assistance to the folks who needed it most, who were, on the official list to receive the target assistance. And that led to like a 20% reduction in poverty. So pretty compelling. And I think that evidence has informed how the country thinks about other assistance programs. And right now we're working with the government on a new program that started during COVID that combines cash transfers and jobs training. So we're working on a really big evaluation of that program now. And I think it's also a really good example on how one engagement can lead to another and really build buy-in and have policy partners who really feel like they're motivated and they're the protagonists of the story.
And a lot of those social protection stories also translate across different countries. So you've seen that in Indonesia, but you've seen that also in the Philippines, and really the adoption of what has worked from the research and from that evidence that's generated, that's picked up by NGOs, by other actors in different contexts, including disaster relief. I mean, that's a big thing in disaster relief now, for how to take those social protection models, for instance, and apply them in different contexts. I think that's also really exciting. Anyone else?
I can speak to the EPoD training question about who we're working with. So yes, direct with government, but also definitely with NGOs and other policy actors we even work with, like the private sector. A good example of this was in August, we worked with the UNCDF, the United Nations Capital Development Fund, to do a program on migrant remittances, financial services, products for migrants. And we brought everyone over to NI and Taubman. We had regulators, central bankers, we had some private sector fintechs, we had NGOs, it was all with the UN. And the magic that happens in those conversations, like normally a regulator and someone, with a startup for financial services for migrant remittances specifically, like they're not going to be sitting down and having conversations kind of away from their typical environments. And so that is probably one of the things that I do think we've answered a little bit, which when COVID hit, we brought all of our training online. And I had this moment of like, do we just bring everything online? It's more sustainable. I think about how much we spend flying. We can do it. We can do translation, all this cool stuff that arose. But I do think the question I've answered is like, you need both. There's room for both, because there's no substitution for like the conversation that you have in the hallway as you walk out of the training.
Well, for me, on the questions of what have we quote unquote solved, for me, the question is like a boxer that is not nervous about his next fight. If you're not nervous about your next fight, you're likely to get knocked out. So I think we haven't solved everything. We're in the process of kind of understanding our current understanding of things. So in that respect, I think three things that I'm very excited about all have to do with how we're trying to reframe the discussion about key issues from the perspective of kind of the global south or developing countries. So there is a huge discussion about immigration that is very much focused on the perspective of the US and the perspective of Europe, but there is a huge discussion about migration, about how even developing countries are much more restrictive in terms of international migration than the developed countries, and implicitly so against the high-skilled immigrants, which would significantly favor their economies. And it's kind of an interesting puzzle to understand why developing countries are, there are good rationales once you put in the sense of us and practitioner hat, but theoretically, it's kind of a very interesting question to understand the value and limitations of migrations to developing countries. Two, there is a lot of discussion in the global decarbonization agenda about reducing emission and reducing our carbon footprint. But there is, in our view, a huge opportunity for countries in the global south to be protagonists in being major sources of renewable energy to the world and being major sources of inputs to the goods that would be used in the global decarbonization agenda, which means that developing countries have a role to play that go beyond reducing your relatively small carbon emissions to make these huge contributions to the world. And third, this idea of remote work that may have to do with cities in US cities and other cities around the world. The question around remote work is how this will impact our city centers and our retail and people not going to the office. And kind of our perspective is if a thing can be done from home, it can be done from anywhere. So things that are currently done in New York and in San Francisco and in major US or European metropolitan areas, could they now be done in Bogota, New Delhi, Lagos, etc.? And could this present diversification opportunities of service diversification opportunities in the developing world that would allow these places to kind of jumpstart their development, especially now that we're questioning the limits of the previous development model focused around the manufacturing of export. So I think a lot of what is exciting is, first, these are not settled matters, but treating these quote unquote settled matters from the perspective of the developing world rather than where a lot of the discussion has been so far.
It reminds me of a Rubik's Cube, you know, when you look at a Rubik's Cube, once you start changing it
Yeah.
even a little bit, it changes every possible formula of how you think about it. And I think that's actually the transitions that many of you have captured here of how we think. It's not necessarily that what we are looking at may be different, but how we look at it and from whose perspective, I think actually could change some of those outcomes. I think about that Rubik's Cube a lot. Manasa, what's on your mind?
I have definitely not solved. But I think I'm over the past 2 years during my time at Harvard, I've definitely grown to appreciate the role of land use planning and land policy in thinking about issues of decarbonization, say remote work, and how we can create more sustainable as well as more vibrant cities and regions across the world. So I think that's been a topic of interest for me lately.
So I know we're wrapping up at a time, and so I just want to end with two just maybe some concluding thoughts from this great discussion today. So first, I love the word, Douglas, I'm gonna use it with your permission to just think about how we are all can be protagonists in writing a different version of the future here as we think about addressing some of the most pressing challenges in international development. And I think the empowerment that actually comes with that is something that to me is really energizing and exciting, because it means we're not just passively watching the news and seeing destruction and all the challenges everywhere, but we're really thinking about wherever we sit in the food chain, the roles we can play and the power we can give others as part of that. And we have a huge role and the privilege being here at Harvard to think about the empowerment piece and how we do that. And then the second just to say is I'm so excited with what you all shared with the wealth of the different opportunities that any Harvard student or alum or anyone else that's interested in the work of the Center for International Development can do. Definitely check out our newsletters, website, social media feeds, lots of different ways to engage if you're here on campus or wherever you are all around the world. I'm really grateful to the Harvard Worldwide Week for letting CID join this really important conversation about how Harvard is part of a global community and how you can engage wherever you are in the world. And I'm so grateful to each of you to showing up on this rainy Friday morning to energize us. So in so many ways about the work that we are doing here at Harvard and how anyone can engage with us in so many different ways to help us solve some of these complex and challenging problems. So thank you very much. And we will be sharing this recording for those that couldn't make it online. So thank you very much.